I am Stanley Esrol, and I am here to introduce you to the Schiller Institute's ongoing series of conferences designed to make sure you understand and know how to defeat what is called the rules-based international order, perpetrated by those would-be masters of the planet who have deliberately robbed us of tens of millions of lives through disease, famine, war, and other products of the underdevelopment that they insist on. The order is promoting the destruction of modern economy, especially modern high-density energy generation, by enforcing the climate change rule. And they never speak this rule. They never speak any of these rules. But the rule is, thou shalt massively reduce the amount of energy used by closing industrial and agricultural production and reducing the consumption of food and other materials required to sustain human life. In this, they are attempting to destroy those advanced nations that are aiding underdeveloped nations in modernizing energy production, healthcare, advanced transportation systems, including high-speed mass transit, modern bridges, pipelines, vaccines, testing facilities, hospital facilities, including adequate intensive care unit capacity to deal with massive pandemics everywhere. The current and previous United States presidencies have attacked nations that accept assistance in acquiring vaccines, improving their producing capacity, or other needs from China or Russia, with sanctions that are destroying their economies and, by depriving them of the necessary resources, destroying the lives of their residents. We will present two brilliant and courageous leaders of the many who presented on June 26th and June 27th. The first is former Virginia State Senator Richard Black, who entered politics after a long and distinguished military career, discussed the unnecessary tragedy in current US relations with China. Dutch geologist Augustinus Berkhout, a leading expert on climate, including the role of carbon dioxide on planet Earth, demonstrated why expanding, not reducing the use of carbon dioxide is a requirement for the expansion and well-being of humanity.
Well, I'm Senator Dick Black. Let me just say, to begin with, I have a military background. I fought in heavy ground combat with the 1st Marine Division, and I was wounded. Both of my radio men were killed beside me. I also flew in combat 269 helicopter missions, and my helicopter was hit by ground fire on 4 occasions and had to crash land in one case. So I just mentioned that by way of saying that I'm a patriot. I've shed a bucket of blood for this country. And so I come at this from a very conservative viewpoint, but one that I think is well informed. Today I'm going to be talking about our relations with China, and I'd like to start with our involvement with Taiwan first of all. Let me say that I am concerned by the growing Sino-American tension. And I certainly disagree with those who feel that the United States must exercise hegemony in Asia. And I hope that we can diminish the tensions. Let me start by reviewing the situation with Taiwan. If you look at things in terms of the historical development over the past 50 years, the relations between China and Taiwan are internal affairs of the nation of China. And just as we would expect that China would refrain from interference in American foreign policy, or rather domestic policy, we should also refrain from over involvement in China's domestic affairs. Going back a little bit, President Nixon made a visit to China in 1971. It's perhaps the most consequential diplomatic visit ever made by an American president. As a result of it, the United States and China benefited enormously from improved trade and national security. These historic developments were founded on the Shanghai Communique, which remains the basis for bilateral relations today. President Nixon and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai found it necessary to resolve the Taiwan issue. There certainly were significant divisions in the views of the two nations, but they bridged those differences by recognizing a one China, two systems policy. And as a practical result of their agreement, we have had peace and harmony between our nations for half a century since. As long as the United States has approached the Taiwan issue with sensitivity and respect, the interests of both parties have flourished and peace has been maintained across the Straits of Taiwan. In 1971, something very significant was done. There are 5 members of the UN Security Council who have a veto power. These are the very 5 powerful nations, one of them being China. And the United Nations General Assembly enacted Resolution 2758 with the tacit approval of the United States, and it transferred the control of that very powerful seat from the Republic of Korea, Chiang Kai-shek's old government, to the PRC, People's Republic of China. And as a result, the government in Beijing was recognized by the United Nations as the legitimate government of China. All of the diplomatic relations shifted over from the bulk of nations, and Taiwan had this situation where they were viewed a little bit like Hong Kong was previously. Taiwan did remain strong and independent, but in 1979, the U.S. Formally recognized the PRC, People's Republic of China, as the sole legitimate government of China. And so it's rather strange to see us today talking as though perhaps they're not the sole legitimate government of China. We went through this period where we had this explosive growth of trade between the two nations. It was very beneficial in many ways to us. In some ways, it had some downsides. But in any event, the tremendous trade eventually caused some trade tensions, inevitably. And President Trump raised some very legitimate issues with the Chinese about their infringement on intellectual property, our patents, our copyrights. I think he was very justified in doing that. He was also very justified in highlighting the lopsided balance of trade, and negotiations were undertaken to resolve these issues. Unfortunately, it was a presidential year when all of this was taking place, and before long, you had Republicans and Democrats both accusing one another of being soft on China, and eventually their rhetoric just degenerated into a shrill cacophony of hostile, unreasoning voices. There were exaggerated claims about Chinese military intentions towards Taiwan, and those were responded to by provocative naval exercises by the United States, and in turn, China has made somewhat provocative overflights of aircraft in the waters off of Taiwan. Neither of those was necessary. They simply were a stick in the eye to one another. I think the growing Sino-American tensions have benefited no one. And I believe that US leaders would be wise to rekindle President Nixon's most enduring legacy, which was the normalization of relations between the two countries. Now, let me shift just a minute. I want to talk about about China's dealing with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. Xinjiang province is a huge northwestern region of China. It's very arid, it's sparsely populated. There's a considerable amount of poverty there just because of the situation. Again, it's important to understand the context of these things when you hear, well, the poor Uyghurs are being set upon. In 2014, there were knife-wielding terrorists who seized the Kunming train station, and they attacked the Han Chinese in a very famous attack. Over 170 people were killed or wounded by knife-slashing terrorists. These were Uyghur separatists. They were carrying a hand-painted East Turkestan flag, and they just slaughtered dozens and dozens of people who were totally helpless. This was not the first such attack. There had been dozens of similar terrorist attacks carried out across Xinjiang province. The militant Uyghurs intend to form a radical Islamic state using Wahhabi fundamentalist ideas imported from Saudi Arabia and countries like that. And they want this kind of 7th century, very, very brutal type of governance to take place. And they want to exclude all of the Han Chinese who presently live in Xinjiang province. So the Chinese government was really compelled to react. The China's approach to the Uyghur situation is complex and it's multifaceted. They're taking steps to alleviate the historic poverty in this vast area. And they have a very comprehensive, extremely well-funded economic program. And the idea is to eliminate the root causes of the jihadist radicalization. They have vocational job training, increased literacy, job placement, modernization of agriculture, which is very important there, and construction of modern housing for the people. So we need to put it in perspective and recognize that there is no higher obligation of a nation than to protect its citizens from serious violence. And just as the United States, when we declared the reasons for our breakaway from and for establishing a new government, we said that one of the 4 reasons for establishing the government was to ensure domestic tranquility. And the Chinese have that obligation to their people no less than we do. The Western propaganda about genocide, I believe, is unfair, inaccurate, and irresponsible. Now, I think it's important to understand today what is happening in Xinjiang province. The Turkish government is facilitating the movement of Uyghur militants from China through Turkey into Idlib province of Syria. And there is a 4,000-man brigade of ultra-militant Uyghurs who are fighting against the legitimate government of Syria. They're a part of the Al-Qaeda forces, and they serve under Abu Muhammad al-Julani. They operate out of Al-Shugar, a very key point, defensive point there. And they are a part of the most bloodthirsty terrorists on earth, men who were made famous for beheadings, mass rapes, crucifixions, and slavery. And this is the mentality that they carry with them as they filter back and forth between China and between Syria. So it's very dangerous for them. And I think it's unfortunate. The CIA has supported the terrorists in Idlib province, Syria, with just unwavering support. And we routinely employ terrorists in various hotspots around the world, utterly disregarding the very profound collateral risk that this poses both to the United States and to Europe. There's been discussion of China's suppression of extremism as genocide, and it's nothing of the sort. I think it makes a mockery of the very term genocide. Even the State Department, the Office of Legal Advisor have said that there is not evidence to support the notion of genocide with the Uyghurs. So that's coming from the U.S. State Department. I think the world is besieged by dangerous jihadists, and nations should be cooperating to suppress them and refrain from making them pawns in a dangerous game between the countries. I just like to touch on one other thing as I begin to close. The U.S. and China really should begin to work together to try to resolve some of the points of friction within the world, and I think Syria would be a good place to start. Syria has been war-torn for the past 10 years. The people on both sides, of course, 90% of the country is under the Syrian government, but the other 10% is controlled by the terrorists. And but on both sides, there's a great weariness with the war. And the only thing that really keeps the war going is that we have such an effective naval blockade on Syria, and also we have these Caesar sanctions, which are quite brutal, quite they cause famine in many instances. And if we would simply drop the blockade, drop the sanctions, we could begin rebuilding. And once we rebuild, the young men of Syria have no interest in being soldiers, but they don't have any other option. If you're going to feed your family, you got to be a soldier on one side or the other. And it's time really that they begin to pound their rifles into plowshares and rebuild the country. Now, it's particularly important that China do everything conceivable to help to rebuild Syria. Because remember, there are those 4,000 Uyghur extremists in Al-Shugar. If by some means the terrorists of Al-Qaeda were able to overthrow the nation of Syria, This would vastly empower the Uyghur militants, and they would simply explode back into Xinjiang province, and they would spread the revolution there with enormous quantities of weapons funneled in and so forth. And it really would be an existential threat to the existence of China. It's unfortunate that the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6 are keenly aware of this. We used Operation Cyclone against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, and we fielded a 300,000-man army of terrorists who were trained by Saudi clerics in Wahhabi philosophy, trained to kill Christians and other non-Muslims. There are some within the CIA, I'm quite certain, who look at Xinjiang province and they see an operation for a new, or an opportunity for a new Operation Cyclone, which is what we called the operation that drove the Soviets from Afghanistan. I think this would have terrible implications for the entire world. It would destabilize all of the world if we were to start this up in China. And so I hope that the United States will take a more reasoned approach towards China. At the same time, I am concerned that some of the old Chinese diplomats are now leaving the scene and being replaced by more aggressive diplomats. I think what we need is diplomats who will look for common ground and who will diminish the level of tension so that we can live in peace. We need to always remember that if we end up in combat with China, either we fight a land war in Asia, and we know the results of that, or we engage in a nuclear war. Those are the two options. A nuclear war means the destruction of much of mankind. And so my hope is that we resolve things diplomatically and that cooler heads will prevail. So thank you very much, and I appreciate being with you today.
My name is Guus Berkhout. I'm Professor Emeritus of Geophysics at the Technical University of Delft. I'm one of the co-founders of the International Clientele Group, now consisting of almost 1,000 scientists. Clientele has recently written a letter to EU Vice President Frans Timmermans about the many incorrect assumptions and conclusions in the European climate policy. Clientele received the following response. Please read with me. We are already seeing the effects of climate change across Europe. Prolonged droughts and declining harvests, extreme heat waves, increasing diseases among livestock and crops, 400,000 deaths a year from air pollution and more. What an embarrassing answer. Why scaring people with lies and deceit? Hard facts demonstrate that the real world is entirely different. Let me show you the first factual graph. You see a spectacular drop in the number of victims due to weather extremes such as floods, droughts, hurricanes, forest fires, etc. A century ago, when there were 2 billion people only, weather disasters killed an average of about 500 people 500,000 people a year. Last year, despite an increase in the world's population to 7.6 billion, that number has dropped to an estimated 8,200 victims. So a decrease of over 98%, and measured per million people as much as 99%. This is impressive. Indeed, this is already a major achievement. But in the future, we can do even better. A further decrease of victims will be realized by increases in education, technological development, and wealth. The more knowledgeable and prosperous countries become, the better they can protect themselves from weather extremes. Let me show you the second factual graph. You see the global cost due to weather disasters as a percentage of GDP. Again, it shows a remarkable outcome. Even more so because the elites of the New Green Deal do tell us that the costs of climate disasters are increasing. However, in reality, the costs as a percentage of the global economy has not been rising, but it is falling. This happened at a time when CO2 emissions were rising faster than ever, despite the 25 international climate conferences that try to reduce them. Please look at this picture. Does it not show the absurdity of this climate circus? Let me also show you the embarrassing agreement of the G7 at the Carbis Bay Summit last week. As you see, their aim is net zero CO2 emission in 2050. I ask you, is this G7 plan a sign of stupidity? Or is it a sign of evilness? Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the factual graphs I showed demonstrate that there is no climate crisis at all. The latter has become the slogan of Clintel. But, ladies and gentlemen, there is more good news. In the next reality figures, I show you that more CO2 is even a blessing to nature and mankind. Food supply has increased by more than 30% since 1960. In this graph, you see that the grain yields have been tripled. You also see that the USA and China are doing very well. But this big achievement is also true for the entire world. So the miserable Malthusian pictures of the past are replaced by a very positive outlook. Looking at all those positive developments, my question is, where is the climate crisis? Finally, I will show you even more good news. We see already for decades that more CO2 in the atmosphere is greening the Earth, both being a global phenomenon. Look at this interesting picture. That the Earth is greening is not a surprise, as many experiments have shown over and over again that more CO2 favors plant growth. The Dutch greenhouses are being fed with a surplus of industrial CO2 in order to increase their bioproductivity. Is it not a sign of pure wickedness to charge fees and taxes on CO2 generating activities, while this CO2 is a blessing to nature and mankind?